Greetings. So this is part 2 of the imminent U.S. ground invasion of Iran series. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, we highly recommend watching part 1 where we discuss the motive of the U.S. forces by looking at their regional objectives and what kind of forces they were mustering in the Middle East. In this video, we will be analyzing what a USMC deployment will look like and where potentially, in Iran, will a U.S. ground invasion make the most strategic sense. So let's look at what kind of total force they are bringing to bear. We are looking at a total fighting force of about 3,500 Marines. In effect, there are actually more Marines, about 3,700 in total, but you do want to keep some in reserve to respond to emergency situation or to bring in as reinforcements. Along with the 3,500 Marines, they will be supported by around 100 LAVs known as light armored vehicles. They allow USS forces to quickly move to the objective, but also have some armor to shield them against enemy fire. They will also be supported by Osprey helicopters for airdrops and evacuations, and Super Stallion heavy lift helicopters for airlifting heavy equipment into the objective. Talking about heavy equipment, Marines usually use the M777 155mm howitzers as their mobile artillery. These are highly dependable, and the USMC has been using these for a long time now. Finally, the USMC also might use something like the LCAC or Landing Craft Air Cushion to disembark from the ships for a beach landing. Okay, now that we have established the kind and the type of force that the US is bringing into the region, now let's see what kind of possible targets the US might choose to put the boots on ground. So first on our list is the infamous Karg Island. The island is 30 kilometers off the coast of Iran. It is spread across roughly 20 square kilometers, which is actually fairly small. The population of the island is roughly 8,000 people, although most of these are probably IRGC personnel stationed to defend the island against such invasions. The island densely populated at 400 people per square kilometer. It is also heavily fortified by IRGC. There are probably a lot of tunnels and reinforced bunkers on the island, just for the specific reason that the Karg Island serves as one of Iran's main economic hub, and it is used to export the majority of Iranian crude oil, up to 90%, to nations like China and India. Now we will do is a pro and cons analysis of why is it a good idea to take over Karg, and why it may not be a good idea to take over Karg, and what kind of losses the US might take in order to capture Karg Island. So first, we'll look at the pros. Starting off, if the US is able to successfully capture Karg and occupy it, it will provide US with high leverage, as one of the main strategic objectives of the US is to look for an equalizer for the Strait of Hormuz blockade. And if the US is able to capture Karg successfully, this might just provide US with the counterbalance to negotiate with Iran on favorable terms for the US. Taking over the island would also allow US to control majority of Iran's crude oil exports, so something similar to Venezuela. And the island will also serve as a major staging ground for further operations into Iran. For example, US can fly their special forces from Karg to Tehran, as Tehran is close to Karg. Now we'll be looking at the cons, and there are actually a lot of cons to invading and occupying Karg. So first of all, since Karg is the major economic hub of Iran, it is very heavily fortified and manned by IRGC personnel. The US recently has bombed Karg Island, and specifically targeting the IRGC military installations on Karg, but we know that IRGC does have deep tunnels and reinforced bunkers, so it's safe to say that a lot of IRGC personnel and their military equipment are intact on the island. The US troops, who will be making groundfall on the island, just don't need to worry about the IRGC defenders, but they also need to worry about heavy bombardment, which will be initiated from the Iranian mainland due to close proximity. The IRGC bombardment might include autonomous kamikaze drones, like Shahed 136, SBMs or short-range ballistic missiles, and something like the FPV drones that we have seen used in Russia-Ukraine conflict. It is highly likely that the IRGC will be making heavy use of FPV drones to counter any Marine invasion of the island. And it is estimated that these factors together, dug in IRGC troops and heavy bombardment, the Marines invading the island are likely to take heavy casualties. There will be a lot of wounded Marine, and the situation will be actually made worse by the fact that any medical evacuation or resupply operations to the island will be challenging, if not impossible, due to heavy enemy fire and bombardment, so it won't be possible to land helicopters on the island. Now, the US may use something like speedboats or hovercrafts to evacuate their wounded soldiers, but these are not as efficient as airlifting, so the US is likely to take a lot of casualties if they do decide to invade the island, and there will be a lot of KIAs, which is bad for US. And the last con is actually a pretty big one. Fighting on the island might lead to heavy damage to the Iranian oil infrastructure on the island, which for sure bring a tit-for-tat response from the Iranians by targeting and destroying other oil and gas infrastructure across the GCC countries like Saudi, Kuwait, UAE, and Bahrain, which in turn might cause a global energy catastrophe. So countries like Japan, China, India, Korea, and most of the countries in Southeast Asia that heavily depend on oil from the Gulf to feed the economies. Without the oil from the GCC countries, their economies will shut down, and it might even trigger some adverse conditions such as widespread famine and unrest in these regions. It is worse than it sounds. So looking at the pros and cons, if I was in a position where I was making the call whether to put boots in ground on Karg or not, I will probably avoid Karg for now, as apart from being heavily defended and potential heavy losses for the US, any damage to the oil infrastructure will likely be followed by Iranian retaliation, and it will end up causing a global energy catastrophe. So we can safely assume that even though there has been some posturing from the US leadership about attacking Karg, the US is probably not going to put boots on Karg anytime soon. Let's look at some other options. So next up on our list, we have the Qeshm Island. Qeshm is located in the Strait of Hormuz, just off the coast of Iranian mainland. It is actually a very big island, roughly 2,000 square kilometers across, with a population of approximately 160,000 people. The island is fairly dense, at roughly 100 people per square kilometer, and since Qeshm is located at the Strait of Hormuz, it is in fact very heavily fortified and defended by the ERGC. Now looking at pros and cons for invading Qeshm. So right off the bat, successfully capturing Qeshm will provide US with a very big strategic advantage, as occupying Qeshm will mean control over the Strait of Hormuz. However, we can say that Qeshm, just like Karg, is not a good option for a boots-and-ground operations, as US troops in Qeshm will likely face the same challenges, if not a greater challenge than invasion of Karg. This is due to very close proximity of Qeshm to the Iranian coast, so it will enjoy a lot of support from the Iranian mainland. There will be a constant bombardment and influx of IRGC reinforcements to counter the US troops. And also, the island is heavily populated, with a rough mountainous terrain, so it will be very difficult for US troops to actually move through the island. So we can conclude that Qeshm, again, is not a good choice for any boots-and-ground operation. Moving on, next on our list is the Abu Musa Island. Now, the Abu Musa Island is located roughly 60 kilometers off the coast of UAE, just outside the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. It is actually a very tiny island, roughly 12.8 square kilometers across. Now it is reported to have a population of approximately 4,000 people, potentially all of which are IRGC personnel. However, since this is such a tiny island which is cut off from the mainland, there may not be 4,000 total personnel, but far fewer due to lack of supplies. Important thing to note is that the island is being disputed by UAE, who claims to be the rightful owner of the island, but right now it's occupied by Iran. We can also safely assume that the island is also heavily fortified, and any US boots-on-the-ground operation would also likely encounter heavy resistance from the IRGC, who are already dug in on the island. Now let's do a pros and cons analysis for invasion of Abu Musa. Compared to Qeshm and Karg, Abu Musa Island is probably a less challenging target for the US forces, as it is very far from the Iranian mainland. So even though there will be some bombardment of the island, mainly using kamikaze drones and short-range ballistic missiles. However, the US Marines can actually attack the island from multiple directions and overwhelm the defenders. And since Abu Musa has a flattered terrain, movement across the island will be easy for the mechanized US troops. The big con with Abu Musa is that capturing the island itself doesn't really provide US with a significant strategic advantage, and it does not really provide US with any equalizer or leverage for the Strait of Hormuz blockade. So in our opinion, US won't be probably considering Abu Musa Island for a boots-on-ground operation right now, but they might take over the island in the future, just because UAE, a key US ally, does have a claim on the island. So next on our list is the Chabahar port. It is a commercial hub located in the Chabahar port city, which is actually the southernmost city in Iran. It is located on extreme south of the Iranian coast. The population of the Chabahar County, which is the whole Chabahar region, is roughly 300,000. This might sound a lot, but this is actually a massive area and a desolate desert. So the average population density is roughly just 40 people per square kilometers. So it is scarcely populated. Now we'll look into why Chabahar, the first location on the list, which is not an island, makes the most sense for the US to do a boots-on-ground operation. So first of all, we need to understand that Chabahar is probably not heavily fortified or defended by the IRGC, because the port is actually not a position of interest to the IRGC. Chabahar port was actually developed India, who takes a specific interest in the region. The Shahid Beheshti terminal in Chabahar port was built by India to gain access to the markets of the Central Asian countries, like Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. That's why a key factor why Chabahar port has been developed with commercial infrastructure is due to Indian interests. And as far as Iran and IRGC is concerned, they are not really interested in Chabahar, as it does not serve any strategic interest to them, whether commercially or militarily. So we can assume that Chabahar won't be as heavily defended by IRGC as some of the other locations we have talked about before. Now, before we do a pros and cons analysis about the Chabahar as a target, we need to understand the demographics of the Chabahar region and how it might play a very crucial role in the US invasion. So the Chabahar region historically has been populated by people who are ethnically Bloch. The Bloch are an Iranian nomadic pastoral ethnic group which speaks the Western Iranic Bloch language and are native to the Balochistan region of South and West Asia, occupying parts of Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. The Bloch are similar to the Kurdish people in a way that even though there is a significant 15 million strong ethnic Bloch population living in West Asia, they don't really have their own state. And just like the Kurds, their population are fragmented across various countries. The Bloch people are divided specifically across two countries, which is Iran on the left and Pakistan on the right. So the portion of Balochistan in Iran is called Sistan and Balochistan, and the portion in Pakistan is called Balochistan. The Bloch, compared to the majority of Iran and Pakistan, have their own unique identity, culture, and linguistics. It is important to notice that the Bloch people do practice Sunni Islam, whereas a majority of Iran practices Shia Islam. This has been one of the many reasons for a major divide between the Bloch and the Iranian government, which is Shia-centric, and has fueled a wave of separatist and militant organizations like the Bloch Liberation Front, which were involved in insurgencies against Iran and Pakistan as well, and the Bloch Liberation Army, which are primarily engaged in insurgencies in Pakistan. As recent as January of 2026, the Bloch militants have clashed with the Pakistani army. So these guys are very active in their region, and they do have a sentiment of separatism, with a lot of support from the local Bloch population. This is why the region of southern Iran is not as heavily defended and fortified by the IRGC due to internal resistance from the ethnic Bloch population. As a result, any US invading force will encounter negligible resistance from the IRGC, and might also have local support from the ethnic Bloch population and Bloch militias, who might cut a deal with the US for establishing an independent Balochistan. Now, with this in mind, we can finally do a pros and cons analysis for doing an invasion of Chabahar will make the most sense. So if you bottom right corner of Iran, this is the Chabahar port. Let's say that the US plans to perform a boots on ground here and establish a temporary base. So let's start by looking at the pros. The first pro being, due to the factors mentioned before, this is probably the path of least resistance for the US forces, due to low population density in the area, and a friendly demographic of ethnic Bloch people. So the US forces are likely to face very few or negligible resistance while taking over Chabahar. And if in case the US is able to cut a deal with the Blochi insurgents, just like the Kurdish militia in Iraq and Syria, They can recruit the Bloch as their auxiliary forces, adding to U.S. manpower in the region. In any case, it is highly likely they do get support from the local Iranian Bloch. Another great thing for U.S. is that Chabahar will provide them with great strategic staging ground for further operations inside Iran. So the U.S. can establish their forward base in Chabahar and use it to launch tactical operations against key Iranian cities of Isfahan, Shiraz, and Qom, where most of Iranian nuclear enrichment operations are located. By doing this, the U.S. forces can circumvent the IRGC fortified positions along the Persian Gulf and the difficult terrain of the Zagros Mountains. Another advantage for the U.S. will be the naval assets already in the region, like the aircraft carrier strike groups, which can actively support ongoing U.S. operations. All U.S. operations within Iran will be done under U.S. air supremacy, so this will make it very difficult for the IRGC to fight the U.S. troops on open ground. Now, these are very big positives, but like with all options, there are some negatives as well. So let's take a look at some cons of taking over Chabahar. Any operation aimed at Chabahar port is going to be complex. To elaborate, it is going to involve a lot of moving parts, and not just on the American side, but also on the Iranian side as well, as the U.S. does need to come to an agreement and coordinate with the local Bloch militia. So it's going to be a complex process, and the U.S. does need intensive planning for operational success. And since the operation will be complex, so this will likely involve mission creep, as when you're dealing with complicated things, you're bound to make mistakes, and this will introduce mission creep into the U.S. operations, where additional deployment of troops or resources is required to reach the mission objectives. As the operation is going to be complex, it is going to be time-consuming, and it will require persistence from the U.S. forces. So this by no means will be a decisive or short operation, and it will likely take quite a bit of time for U.S. to first establish a forward base and then line up all their special operations they want to carry out inside Iran. So this is going to be a time-consuming process and will probably take about 2 to 3 months and won't end anytime soon. And the last con is there are high chances that this can trigger a regional conflict, as about 50% of the Bloch ethnic population live in Pakistan. So if the U.S. does decide to cut a deal with the Bloch to establish an independent Bloch state, Pakistan might be distressed by this because it may encourage the ethnic Bloch people in Pakistan to want to join the effort and go separate ways from Pakistan. Hence, this might also bring Pakistan into the U.S.-Iran conflict. Thank you for watching. If you did find that video informative, don't forget to drop a like, and all the views expressed in the video are from our analysis. So if you disagree with our views, it's completely fine. Do feel free to drop a comment down below and let us know what you think. Cheers.